Meet Wyclef Jean. No, not that Wyclef Jean. This Wyclef Jean.
Till November, said I'll be gone till November, I'll be gone till November.
Born in Haiti, Wyclef Jean moved to America when he was 9, where he eventually formed the group The Fugees, consisting of him and his 2 friends, Pras Michael and Lauryn Hill. The Fugees were known for mixing elements of hip-hop with reggae and R&B, becoming one of the pioneers of what is now known as alternative hip-hop. Not only that, but they were also one of the first hip-hop acts to incorporate live instruments into their performance. Although they only released 2 albums, they're widely considered to be one of the most successful groups in history, with their final album, The Score, currently sitting at 7 times platinum. After the release of The Score in 1996, the band eventually broke up so that each of the artists could pursue their own, mind you, very successful solo careers. After the Fugees, Wyclef Jean went on to have an extremely successful solo career, as I said before, being a part of and creating numerous hits like No 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 by Destiny's Child and Hips Don't Lie by Shakira. Damn, I completely forgot he was the man behind
Shakira.
I had to double check my sources on that one. Anyway, back in 1999, there was a little known concert that went by the name of Woodstock. Not the free spirit, peace and love, lovey-dovey hippie Woodstock from the 60s, but more like its evil twin, only that it was born 30 years later. Yeah, I know we've all heard about the infamous Woodstock riots, but that's not what we're here for. Simply put, I believe the riots overshadow one of the greatest musical performances we've ever seen, and that is Wyclef Jean's performance of the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock 99. You heard me right. This performance right here. To actually appreciate the significance of this act, we have to understand where we were as a society at this point in time.
Tony, this is so great you can't believe it. I believe it, Charlie. It's raining, John!
The big difference between the first Woodstock and its predecessor is that the first one actually had a point. The 60s were a tumultuous period of revolution in one of the most significant decades in human history. There was the Cold War, the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, which ended in the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., not to mention the assassination of JFK, the moon landing, the list goes on and on. All of these events inspired counterculture movements that affected everything from the way we dress to the drugs we take. All of these movements and protests also shared a common theme amongst one another: idealism. Idealism derives from metaphysics and states in its most simplest terms that reality is ultimately mental in nature. Essentially, it argues that reality is a construct dependent upon your mind rather than an independent variable. This extends to how the importance of ideas, values, and principles all take precedence over material considerations. Nowadays, I can't help but see idealists as those annoying self-help gurus who spit unpractical, spiritual, virtual advice.
Who do you love the most in the world?
My family.
Good. Who in your family? Pick one.
All of them.
Every day, literally once a day, genuinely sit there for 5 minutes and pretend one of them got shot in the face. I'm being dead serious with you. Every single day, I actually sit and truly try to convince myself one of them got shot in the face. That is the biggest thing I do that leads to the biggest happiness I have.
What?
Besides, let's stick with the point. German philosopher George Hegel invented what we now know as absolute idealism. This, unlike traditional idealism, argues that all things in existence share one transcendent ideal, and that knowledge in general is the system of such idea. For example, how we communicate such idea. In a political sense, idealism refers to a belief in the power of moral and ethical principles to guide policy practice. Generally speaking, idealists would advocate for policies that align to their values, whether or not they are immediately feasible. An absolute idealist would argue that these moral and ethical principles are a part of a system of knowledge that constructs reality. Therefore, instead of combating the idea of war with violence and hostility, an idealist would combat it with peace and love.
Some of us don't eat pork. Some of us don't eat shellfish. But all of us love chicken.
You can simmer it in a tagine.
In a soup, you can boil it.
Spread the word. Peace and chicken.
AKA, instead of protesting the Vietnam War with pitchforks and torches.
When do we get to light our torches?
When it gets dark.
Ah, I see. Oh, hey, I got another question there. Suppose, hypothetically, a guy had already lit his torch. I mean, it'd be cool if he could just keep it lit, huh?
The American public decided to combat it with drugs and rock and roll. This is exactly what Woodstock 69 was about. Peace, love, unity, and the denouncement of the Vietnam War.
Doing a good job here. Thank you very much. Glad to do it for these kids. My son's here, too. And I got one over in Vietnam, too. He's up in the DMZ right now called Flying Helicopters.
It was more than a festival. It was an act of protest against the powers that be.
The grandson of Mahatma Gandhi asked me what's happening in America. And I said, America is helping everybody in the material field, but the time has come for America to help the whole world with spirituality also.
Now, let's fast forward 30 years and see where idealism got us. And by us, I mean you guys, America. From an economic standpoint, the USA was flourishing. Between 1969 and 1999, America's nominal GDP multiplied tenfold, going from 1 trillion to 10 trillion in a matter of 30 years. Compare this to Japan, the country with the second largest GDP at the time, hadn't even cracked 5 trillion by the end of the 20th century. Although there were numerous factors at play that helped strengthen America's economic power throughout this time, none played a bigger role than the act to deregulate. Starting in the 70s, with Richard Nixon in power before his impeachment, there was a push to deregulate industries that were previously subject to heavy government regulation. Industries that include banking, transportation, energy. This meant removing barriers to entry, reducing government oversight, and allowing greater competition. One of the most famous acts of deregulation came in 1971 when Nixon abandoned the gold standard. By removing the gold standard, America's dollar was no longer tied to the value of gold, meaning that the government had flexibility to manage its economy by adjusting interest rates, money supply, and impacting inflation. This can be seen as America's first step towards neoliberalization. While having a flexible monetary policy meant more control over the economy, it also led to increased volatility among currencies. As an indirect result, banks began hoarding liquidity for their own growth so to have a way to attract corporate customers. Bank holding companies were created to undermine financial regulations by acting as investment advisors to real estate investment trusts and mutual trusts, by leasing property, providing services like bookkeeping, and even selling insurance. What you're seeing here is a trend that continues to grow today. Banks putting too many hands in the cookie jar, so to speak.
Put that cookie down now!
Moving on to the 80s, we see Democrat-elected President Jimmy Carter continue this fabulous trend of deregulation, and as a result caused one of the worst recessions in human history. Remember how I told you Nixon abandoning the gold standard meant the government could adjust its interest rates? Long story short, what happened was Jimmy Carter decided to raise those interest rates to combat serious inflation that was occurring in the 70s due to rising oil prices as a result of the Iranian Revolution. At the same time though, President Carter was busy deregulating more financial policies, such as the Depository Institutions Deregulation and Monetary Control Act, which essentially gave the bank holding companies mentioned prior and the Federal Savings and Loan Corporation the freedom to engage in riskier investments. The deregulation led to insane amounts of fraud led by insiders who would write faulty loans that would never end up being repaid.
So let me get this straight. The bank calls you up. They give you the bonds they want to sell. They give you clients. They give you money to run your business. They give you fat fees for doing so. But you represent the investors? Is that right?
Yeah.
No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!
Banks continued to expand rapidly into real estate, which eventually led to the collapse of over 100 different branches across the country. This included the Continental Illinois National Bank and Trust Company, the nation's 7th largest bank at the time, which was eventually bailed out by Jimmy Carter and the government for $4.5 billion. The crazy part is though that the $4.5 billion bailout is nothing compared to what the Federal Savings and Loans Insurance Corporations did. These companies distribute savings and loans, otherwise known as SNLs, and are regulated by the Federal Home Loan Bank Board. But after all of Nixon's and Carter's acts of deregulation, they were severely underfunded and had nowhere near the resources needed to enforce SNLs. Further deregulations took place and SNLs were allowed to shift their investment focus away from traditional home mortgages towards higher leverage investments, things like restaurants and casinos. As interest rates continued to grow, more and more loans were being foreclosed on, leading to billions in assets turning to nothing in a blink of an eye.
I got a $100 check from my grandma, and my dad said I need to put it in the bank so it can grow over the years.
Well, that's fantastic. A really smart decision, young man. We can put that check in a money market mutual fund. Then we'll reinvest the earnings into foreign currency accounts with compounding interest, and it's gone.
What?
Though the exact number has never been released, it's rumored that the SNL crisis ended up costing taxpayers $125 billion through additional government bailouts.
Sirs, another insurance company is going under.
Now determining most prudent move for insurance company.
Bailout.
The most prudent move is a bailout. Bail out the insurance company.
In the midst of the recession, America's presidency transferred from Jimmy Carter to Ronald Reagan. And who could have guessed it? He did the exact same thing his boys did prior. Deregulate. Essentially, to escape the recession, Reagan heavily reduced tax rates for the wealthy, leading to increased public investment and consumption, subsequently trickling down, leading to economic growth and less pressure on interest rates. Although Reagan's policies did relieve the USA of its recession, they ultimately benefited the wealthy far more than the average American citizen. According to the Congressional Budget Office, between 1979 and 1989, the top 1% of earners saw their after-tax income increase by 87%, compared to just 4% for the bottom 20% of earners. But you know, as the Gitter puts it, this is all in the name of good old free market capitalism. Fuck them commies, right?
Born in the USA, I was born in the USA. Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
The final president to hammer the neoliberal nail into the socialist coffin is none other than beloved Democrat Bill Clinton. When I say beloved, let me be clear, I mean he loved using his power to exploit young girls getting into politics. Yeah, I know, I'm skipping the older Bush, but let's be real, compared to the big dogs of deregulation, Bush was only a pup. I mean, he did do some decent things as president, like end the Cold War and oversee the fall of the Berlin Wall, but he also kinda sorta started his own recession and spent $61 billion on the Gulf War, which did not take place. Anyway, back to my boy Bill, who took over in 1993 and ran the joint till 2001. Bill did some pretty controversial things while in office. I mean, for one, he was the one to introduce NAFTA, the free trade agreement that we've all heard about in school at one point or another. NAFTA is basically a contract between Canada, America, and Mexico that says there should be no barriers to trade. This was great for the economy because it meant prices would drop, leading to much higher rates of consumption.
Guess what? It grows the economy. Benefits everybody. Hurts nobody.
Hurts nobody. Hurts nobody.
But if you're like me, you have to wonder, why exactly did prices drop?
I believe we have made a decision now that will permit us to create an economic order in the world that will promote more growth, more equality, better preservation of the environment, and a greater possibility of world peace.
You sure about that? You sure about that? That's why? You sure it wasn't because after the thing that happened to me, no one could look at me without dying laughing? You sure about that? You sure about that's not why?
Given that NAFTA was all about deregulating barriers to trade, the contract provided corporations with more leniency in how they go about pushing their product to consumers. Corporations were allowed to relocate to places like Mexico where land and wages were cheaper, and there was a lack of health and safety precautions. Obviously, this was bad for a lot of reasons. In America, for one, NAFTA cost workers 700,000 jobs, and the ones who are lucky enough to keep their jobs almost universally saw their wages cut. I mean, across the entire country. But not only that, there was also a 50% decrease in labor union membership because NAFTA gave corporations the opportunity to threaten workers with relocation. In Canada, NAFTA also had devastating consequences for the environment, as the agreement meant the country could no longer interfere with the company's right to profit. So if a company was busy spilling sewage into our Great Lakes, there was nothing we could do about it. In fact, NAFTA is the very reason why there are so many Mexican immigrants in the US. Millions of Mexicans were put out of work by the automated factories migrating to their country, and as a result were forced to find a new home. I'm sorry, but let it soak in how ironic that is. The contract that essentially helped turn America into the definitive land of the free is the very same thing that causes these far-right Republicans to lose their shit over people moving into their country. I mean, it's such a shame these folks are too busy sucking off the elites who benefited from all this than to actually understand policy.
In the arms of the angel, fly away.
Ooh. Anyways, I could go further into Clinton's controversial policies. Like, for example, I don't know, how he signed the Regal and Neal Interstate Banking and Branching Efficiency Act. That was a tongue twister. Anyways. Essentially, that policy eliminated restrictions on interstate banking and branching and led to the financial sector being completely monopolized. But that's neither here nor there. I hope you guys are starting to sense a trend with this. Thanks to glorious deregulation, the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. All of these influential figures, whether they rep Democrat or Republican, red or blue, blood or crip, they only care about one thing: expanding their pockets. They ran the country like it was a business, and if you look at it from an economic standpoint, it has seemingly worked out for them. You may be sitting there thinking to yourself, that's a tad bit bitter, don't you think?
You sound bitter.
Me? Bitter? Fuck no. I think it's hilarious.
It's not like these guys are supervillains from Gotham.
I mean, I know you're a sophisticated guy. The world is a mess. The world is as angry as it gets. Well, you think this is going to cause a little more anger? The world is an angry place. All of this has happened. We went into Iraq. We shouldn't have gone into Iraq. We shouldn't have gotten out the way we got out. The world is a total mess. The world is a mess, Danny.
But let's not forget, I'm only representing how America felt at the time. Remember all those lovey-dovey hippies from 30 years ago? What happened to them? Their idealism slowly vanished, and what was left was stone-cold cynicism.
I didn't need any of you. I didn't need my family members. I didn't need anyone but me. No one, there's not one person in the world that's ever helped me. Give me a hell yeah!
Hell yeah!
While the rich were busy manipulating policies and getting their well-deserved tax breaks, it was the middle class and the poor who were busy dealing with the repercussions.
What the hell's going on over here?
Oh, Frank's trying to kill himself.
Oh my God, is he all right? Frank, are you all right?
Don't try to stop me.
Oh my God. Oh, so he's alive.
Lost all my money in a Ponzi scheme, Charlie. I'm broke.
His neck is so thick, I feel like he's just gonna swing and dangle around for a really long time.
That's what it is. That's what it is. Let's go. Frank, it's not gonna work for you. Your neck's too thick,
Tie
buddy.
a chair to me. Tie a chair to me.
Time's tough, huh?
Shit.
Deregulation in the 80s led to the government taking a hands-off approach towards the AIDS epidemic, which was one, extremely scary to the public, obviously, and two, presented immense stigmatization towards the LGBTQ community. Also, even though we're just 20 years removed from the civil rights movement, racism continued to run rampant, with issues like police brutality being publicized as regularly as ever, leading to the Rodney King riots of '92.
I feel that it's a great travesty of justice. I feel that the jury in Simi Valley gave the okay to continue to abuse and oppress and suppress black people in this country. I feel that there is an undercurrent of racism and that the system is rotten to the core. And I couldn't sit in my home and just watch it on television. I had to come here and let my voice be heard.
Deregulation also played a part in the opioid epidemic starting in the 90s. Medical companies were allowed to prescribe more addictive painkillers, leading to another few 100,000 deaths and counting. There was also a wave of mass shootings that have been attributed to America's lack of gun regulation, the most famous of which is Columbine, occurring only a couple months before Woodstock '99. The Vietnam War was replaced with the Gulf War, and then eventually the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, and so on. At this point in time, America was split into two camps. There were those in favor of neoliberalism and those who saw the dangers of unregulated capitalism. There were thinkers like Francis Fukuyama, the author of the controversial book The End of History and the Last Man, who argued that there simply is no better political alternative than to liberal democracies being tied to their market economies.
I have not heard anyone posit an alternative political economic form other than liberal democracy tied to a market economy that I think will be a higher form of human civilization that will produce higher levels of prosperity and more happiness for the people that live in it.
Remember that dude Hegel I mentioned 20 minutes ago who popularized idealism? Part of his whole theory is that history is just a dialectical process where conflicts and contradictions between ideas and social structures are resolved through synthesis. What this means is that history is essentially just a debate, where theses are produced, antitheses are then proposed to counter the dominant idea and produce conflict, and thus a synthesis is born between the two. According to Hegel, this will inevitably lead to quote-unquote the end of history, not in the sense that everything will cease to exist, but the end of history in the sense that we will eventually reach a limit to our rationality and freedom. Communists like Karl Marx believed that the end of history would result in the end of all social and economic inequalities, which meant an abolition of private ownership, hence where the quote, "from each according to their ability to each according to their needs" comes from. However, modern thinkers like Francis Fukuyama interpret Hegel in the opposite manner, by saying that the ultimate synthesis of human political systems is the liberal free market democracy. Meanwhile, other philosophers and economists such as Slavoj Žižek and Amartya Sen argue that it's naive to focus on economic development as a measure for well-being, and that this line of thinking ignores ongoing struggles and social injustices that are prevalent among existing neoliberal policies.
The problem of this last economic crisis, financial crisis, 2008.
Right.
What the right-wingers don't admit is that, I'm sorry, but this was not some social democrat spending too much money. This was a crisis of the lack of regulation. This was, once I wrote an ironic article, to that Ayn Rand question, who is John Galt? Mm-hmm. This is John Galt crisis. Mm-hmm. Alan Greenspan was an objectivist. Mm-hmm. So, you see, how to put it, we should stop this myth. For me, the big result, what people should learn from 2008 financial crackdown, is that neoliberalism first is a myth.
Yeah.
First, if you look all around the world, but the role of the state is not diminishing. If anything, it's diminishing where it should be more.
But I'd add one thing, though. Alan Greenspan, though, should have known better. I'm not going to let you let him off the hook completely. That's not.
No, I'm not. Okay. I think that he's co-responsible.
All right, got it.
But I think that it's precisely because of his objectivism.
Right.
So again, it's not, it's incredible ideological operation how somehow this the fundamentalist Republicans almost convinced us you see too much spending, too much state regulation. Right. No, it was quite the opposite.
Bands like Nirvana, Radiohead, Rage Against the Machine, as well as artists like Basquiat and Herring, even films like Taxi Driver and The Matrix, all reflected this sentiment as well. As such, they sort of revived the counterculture narrative from the 60s, but this time in a completely different tone.
You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
But the choice between the blue and the red pill is not really a choice between illusion and reality. Of course, Matrix is a machine for fictions, but these are fictions which already structure our reality. If you take away from our reality the symbolic fictions that regulate it, you lose reality itself.
I want a third pill.
By the 90s, people were disillusioned with the idealist protests 30 years prior. They weren't seen as nothing more than a spectacle of amusement where ideology was used to line the pockets of the rich. People were led like a lamb to the slaughter to believe that free markets led to individual freedoms. Rather than abiding by the unwritten rules of neoliberalism, counterculture took issue with things like mass consumerism and ideology, seeing them as no more than instruments that work to normalize forms of power and domination.
What are we then? Consumers.
Right. We are consumers. We are byproducts of a lifestyle obsession. Murder, crime, poverty, these things don't concern me. What concerns me are celebrity magazines, television with 500 channels, some guy's name on my underwear, Rogaine, Viagra, Olestra, Martha Stewart. Fuck Martha Stewart.
This might be as good a time as ever to share one of the hardest bars I've ever read in a book. in Capitalist Realism, written by Mark Fisher, he writes, when talking about Kurt Cobain, in his dreadful lassitude and objectiveless rage, Cobain seemed to have give wearied voice to the despondency of the generation that had came after history, whose every move was anticipated, tracked, bought, and sold before it had even happened. Cobain knew he was just another piece of the spectacle, that nothing runs better on MTV than a protest against MTV. In other words, what the late Mark Fisher is trying to say here is that it is literally in capitalism's best interest for the culture to rail against capitalism. Think of movies like The Joker, V for Vendetta, or The Watchmen, for example. All these movies share heavy anti-capitalist themes, yet they inherently strengthen the very system they are trying to critique by being box office hits and whatnot. So, in a world where ideology and as a result things like art are co-opted by capitalism in the name of profit, we have to ask ourselves, how do we actually produce meaning? A meaning insofar that it doesn't inevitably come down to the fact of needing more money. Well, we can't really. At the end of the day, even the most anti-capitalist art will still hold some absurd inherent irony. However, and you're gonna have to bear with me for this, but isn't the nature of capitalism itself absurd? I mean, it's a product of systems we've developed to free us from irrationality, being irrational humans with no rules and whatnot, but in turn has made us into these objects that represent our own irrational beliefs. Moral of the story, it's pretty damn absurd. Now bear with me for a sec. Just maybe, to counter this, we have to dive equally into absurdity ourselves, at least through our art. In 1942, German Jewish philosopher Erich Feuerbach released the collection of essays titled Mimesis, the representation of reality in Western literature. Mimesis is plainly defined as the imitation of life in art, and goes all the way back to pre-Socratic aesthetic theory. Feuerbach asserts that art is a representation of our reality, or at least the closest thing we have to reality. When you think of the Renaissance period, for example, your concept of reality is based entirely upon the art of Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Michelangelo, and more, whether or not you are consciously aware of it. So, living in a society that is tied to its market economies, or in other words, a society that is run for profit, you are then an object that produces said profit, an object that represents our irrational beliefs. The existential angst that comes from being an object that lacks purpose can only be classified as absurd. So to represent the reality we live in, Feuerbach asserts that we have to dive equally into absurdity ourselves. That right there, ladies and gentlemen, is exactly what Wyclef Jean did with his performance at Woodstock 99. Now cue the clip.
This is for my man Jimi Hendrix. Turn up the guitar. At this time, you are free to throw your plastic bottles when I start this record. Hold on. You are free to smoke your weed when I drop this record. Turn my guitar up loud, loud, loud. How many of y'all there love Nas Escobar? Make some noise. Hold on.
continuously playing off-key and mixing elements of grunge, rock, hip-hop, and reggae into the Star-Spangled Banner, Wyclef Jean produced absolute pandemonium. In other words, irrational chaos. It wasn't a parody. It was him venting his frustrations with the state of the country and its values. Before he plays, he shouts out Jimi Hendrix, the man behind the triumphant performance of the national anthem at the same festival 30 years prior.
This is for my man Jimi Hendrix.
By distorting Jimi's famous act, Wyclef Jean is obviously sending a message that the generations that came after are fed up and at their limit. Asking the audience to throw trash at him during his performance is more than Wyclef Jean trashing that national anthem. It's him making a statement, much like what we've seen from Colin Kaepernick in the NFL. The anthem is a representation of the system of values that make up America. By trashing it, he is rejecting the ideology of America. The same ideology that turns us into nothing more than objects of consumerism, where all that matters is what we buy or sell and how we impact the economy. The whole performance is like that scene in Titanic where the musicians play as the ship is sinking. All of these individuals on board, aka at Woodstock, were promised the next great journey, aka the Great American Dream. And what they're left is watching their individual freedoms and visions crumble. The whole performance also reminds me of the famous quote by art critic Theodor Adorno, who said in his work Aesthetic Theory that the darkening of the world makes the irrationality of art rational, radically dark and dark. 25 years later, we can't help but see Wyclef Jean's rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner as more rational than ever, as it captures the existential dread and the absurdities that plague a society dominated by its economy.
Gentlemen, it has been a privilege playing with you tonight.